Joseph Newman's motor. Joseph Newman is a man who impresses me. He performs experiments, reports the results and then bases theoretical conclusions on the results of his own experiments. This is the true scientific method. Joseph has been granted a patent and he has written a book. I would recommend that you buy a copy of his book and help support his work by doing that, but unfortunately, as I understand it, the printing plates for the book were destroyed in a fire and printed copies of his book are effectively unobtainable. You can download a .pdf version from the http://www.free-energy-info.tux.nl website, but please be aware that the overall file size is 100 MB and so the download will take quite some time. A background download can be had from www.mediafire.com or the alternative www.filefactory.com. File Newman PDF link, while the link to Joseph's own website is www.josephNewman.com. In very brief outline, Joseph has built a motor which can access free energy. He has a theory about where the excess energy is coming from and how it is acquired by his designs. He has also built a large stationary motor to demonstrate his theory, and he has built a motor into a car. The car engine runs on very minor battery power. Joseph's patent is included in the appendix. With the kind permission of the Joseph Newman Organization, I am going to attempt to introduce you to the important scientific conclusions reached by Joseph and the energy machine which he designed and which is based on those conclusions. Joseph has a keen inquiring mind and thinks things through for himself rather than blindly accepting everything he is told. This description contains illustrations and wording taken from parts of Joseph's book published in 1984, and I should like to express my thanks for being given permission to use this material. Joseph Newman's motors all consist of a very powerful permanent magnet which rotates or oscillates in or near a coil with a very large number of turns of copper wire. The coil is energized by a battery pack, and the magnetic field produced by the coil provides the force needed to move the permanent magnet. A mechanical switching device or commutator reverses the direction of current flow through the coil every half cycle, and in some models, it also cuts off the current input between the current reversals. The main difference between Joseph's designs and previous motors is one of scale, as Joseph uses very large coils and very large ceramic magnets weighing up to 700 pounds. His smaller motors use powerful rare earth magnets and the coils are wound with 100,000 turns of copper wire. This creates a very high coil resistance and the battery pack voltages are correspondingly high, being in the hundreds to thousands of volts range. The torque or turning power applied to the magnet in these motors is proportional to the magnet's strength, the number of turns in the coil and the current flowing in the coil. In Joseph's motors, very large torques can be developed by very small currents. In one demonstration, a motor running on 3000 volts at 0.8 milliamps has such power that it is not possible to stop the motor by holding its 2-inch, 50 mm, diameter shaft, though the current can be raised by trying to stop it, to 3 milliamps, or 9 watts of power. Joseph's motors are different in other ways. If fluorescent tubes are connected across the motor coil, they light up due to the coil's collapsing magnetic field each time the current direction is switched. These fluorescent tubes are used to protect the mechanical switch from arcing damage. The additional power produced in these tubes is at a very high frequency of 10 to 20 MHz. This radio frequency current has been accurately measured and it exceeds the battery input current by a factor of 5 to 10 times in the different motors. The measured current and voltage were in phase, indicating a real power output. To understand the thinking behind these motors, we need to follow Joseph's experiments and the deductions which he made from those experimental results. Joseph considered, and thought carefully about statements made by the two scientific giants James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, and this led him to valuable insights. It appears that Maxwell and Faraday were the only people who considered that lines of magnetic force are actual physical entities and not just a method of representing notional forces, and those lines of force are actually streams of matter in motion. Maxwell says, in speaking of the energy of the field, however, I wish to be understood literally. All energy is the same as mechanical energy, whether it exists in the form of motion or in that of elasticity, or in any other form. The energy in electromagnetic phenomena is mechanical energy. Joseph then considered Michael Faraday's electrical generator and the implications of the way in which it operated. Conductor moves down. Here, a loop of wire is moved downwards from level A to level B. This movement causes an electrical current to flow leftwards along the wire as shown by the red arrows. Joseph's question was, why does it go in that direction every time the wire is moved in that way? Conductor moves upwards. If the wire is moved upwards through the same magnetic field, then the current flowing in the wire moves in the opposite direction. Why? How does the current know which way to go? If you turn the magnetic field round by reversing the position of the magnetic fields and then move the wire loop in the same way as before, the current flows in the opposite direction. How does the current know which way to flow, or which way round the magnets are turned as it does not touch them? Conductor moves up and down. The next interesting point is that if the wire loop is moved up and down between the magnets, but turned to be parallel to the flux flowing between the poles, then no current flows in the wire, no matter how quickly the wire is moved up and down. Conductor moves upwards. Another point is that if the wire loop is moved slowly up through the magnetic flux, the electric current which flows as a result of that slow movement, moves at the speed of light, flowing from A towards B. Now, if the wire loop is disconnected and turned over, the part which was at A now moved to B, and the same movement of the wire carried out, the current flow is in exactly the same direction although its path along the wire is reversed, because the wire has been reversed. This shows that the direction of current flow is not affected by the wire itself. According to conventional teachings, this electric current flow was not a result of the magnetic field, as the magnetic lines of force were supposed to be imaginary, consisting of potential energy and no kinetic energy. It became clear to Joseph that this conventional teaching was wrong. Instead, it seemed clear that the magnetic field consists of particles which have mechanical characteristics, and those particles must be moving at the speed of light within the magnetic field. A key question seemed to be, how does the current know which direction to flow, as the direction was always consistent? After careful consideration, it occurred to Joseph that the answer was provided by the actions of a gyroscope. Here, if the axle of the spinning flywheel, or gyroscope, is pressed downwards, it moves off in the direction shown by the red arrows. However, if the axle is pressed upwards, then the axle moves in the opposite direction as shown by the red arrows. This effect is, of course, reversed if the direction of rotation of the gyroscope is reversed, as it will be if viewed from the other side, in the same way as the current flow direction in the wire is reversed if the magnetic poles are swapped over. Now, if the gyroscope axle is moved up and down equally on both sides, there is no resulting sideways force. Parallel force up. Parallel force down. The action of the gyroscope axle matched the current flow in the wire in every respect, so it became clear to Joseph that the particles flowing between the poles of the magnet were spinning as well as moving at the speed of light. This gyroscopic mechanical motion of the particles accounts for all of the characteristics of the current flow in a wire which is being moved through a magnetic field. This is a major insight on the part of Joseph. May I remark that these particles are not coming from the magnet itself, but are flowing in from the zero-point energy field, that flow being caused by the broken symmetry of the zero-point energy field generated by the dipole effect of the poles of the magnet. That is why energy can appear to be drawn from magnets for years on end. Joseph then went on to consider the physical aspects of permanent magnets. There were two very significant facts which had to be considered. The first of these is that different materials have markedly different magnetic characteristics. Soft iron produces weak permanent magnetic field. A bar of soft iron does become a permanent magnet when pulsed briefly with a strong magnetic field, but if exactly the same level of magnetic pulsing is applied to a similar bar of an alloy of iron, nickel and cobalt, a permanent magnet is also produced, but the magnetic field of the alloy is very much stronger than that of the soft iron bar. This shows that the molecular structure of the bar has a major effect on the resulting magnet. In passing, please be aware that the more powerful magnets available nowadays are so strong that they can easily injure you. If you pick up a magnet and inadvertently get close to a second one, the loose magnet will jump some inches and try to connect to the one in your hand, crushing your fingers in the process and proving very hard indeed to shift in order to deal with the injury. I have also seen it alleged that US alnico, aluminium/nickel/cobalt alloy, magnets are deliberately doped with K40 isotope, which renders them useless fairly quickly. The source of this information is highly dubious, but the extra sales advantages to the magnet manufacturers would be significant. Also, the advantages for the people wanting to suppress the creation of free energy magnet motors would be major, as many talented US inventors are likely to think that their successful magnet motors were failures because the magnets appeared to be drained of power by being used in their design, when in fact, the design is perfectly good. So I will leave you to make up your own mind about the matter and remark that Bill Muller found that his powerful Chinese manufactured magnets were in perfect condition after 11 years of use. Another point which Joseph considered was the fact that when successive magnetic pulses are applied to a ferromagnetic metal bar, the resulting magnetic field strength reaches a definite maximum value, and further pulsing has no further beneficial effect. Weak magnetic field, few atoms aligned. Greater atomic alignment produces strong magnetic field. This is considered to be the magnetic pulse aligning atoms in the metal. Eventually, all of the atoms are aligned, and so not further effect can be produced by further pulsing. This alignment can be destroyed if the metal bar is heated to a sufficiently high temperature, forcing the atoms into such an energetic state that the alignment is lost. It should perhaps be stressed here that the magnet itself does not have any power, in spite of seeming to have. Tom Bearden explains this clearly by pointing out that what happens is that the opposite poles of the magnet created a dipole which unbalances the random quantum foam nature of the local environment, the zero-point energy field, and that causes continuous energy flows from the environment. The magnet power is coming from the environment and not from the magnet itself. If you find this hard to believe and think that you are just getting back the electromagnetic energy which you pumped into the metal when creating the magnet in the first place, then apply simple arithmetic. Assume that you get back exactly 100% of the original power and calculate how long that amount of power would allow the magnet support its own weight against gravity, when attached to a vertical metal surface. Then ask yourself how come the magnet can do it for years and years on end. Point proved conclusively. Joseph concluded that the attraction of unlike magnetic poles and the repulsion of like poles is caused by the gyroscopic spin direction of the actual physical streams of the lines of force, which he has shown that both of the scientific giants, Maxwell and Faraday, were convinced were actual physical entities. The intuitive genius Nikola Tesla described the zero-point energy field as having the physical characteristics of a gas, capable of having motion, exerting pressure, and yet having particle size so small that it can flow through any physical material. Joseph has concluded that this field flow has a specific spin direction as it flows, certainly for flows caused by the magnetic dipole of a magnet. It should be remembered that the scientific teaching of present-day educational institutions is at least 50 years out of date. We have the most unusual situation where the scientific literature of 100 years ago is actually of better quality than that of today, which does not describe the actual world at all well. Currently, misconception is alive and very well. For example, Maxwell produced equations describing how the world works. Admittedly, these equations are very difficult for people to understand. H. A. Lorentz simplified these equations and his results are mistakenly described as Maxwell's, which they most certainly are not. Tom Bearden illustrates it this way: consider a sailing boat being driven along by the force of the wind against the sails. Maxwell says that there is a vast swathe of wind blowing across the ocean, capable of powering a long row of 1,000 sailing boats side by side. This is the actual physical case. Lorentz has simplified things by saying we will consider one boat and only one boat. As the rest of the wind does not touch any part of the boat, we can ignore it. While that is true for that one boat, what science teaching now says is that the wind can only power a single boat. This is not the actual case, as the environmental wind is not limited to powering just one boat. Sailing regattas would not be much fun if that were the case. This, of course, is just an illustration. Maxwell's equations cover energy and power for the whole universe, and deal with all cases. Lorentz has taken a subset of the conditions described by Maxwell's equations, just the group which apply to closed systems, just one boat on the ocean. Science has latched onto this and now confidently states that everything is a closed system, when in fact, as the zero-point energy field flows through everything, everywhere at all times, and is capable of supplying unlimited additional energy anywhere at any time, there is probably not a single instance of a closed system anywhere in the world. Joseph Newman, and all other serious inventors, have to fight against this conventional science teaching, which is now so entrenched that it has become the equivalent of religious dogma, and scientists are unwilling to consider valid observations which do not fit in with the very limited Lorentz concept of the environment. They say perpetual motion is impossible, which means that Newton was wrong when he said that a moving body will keep on moving indefinitely unless some force acts on it to stop it. You can see then, that when Joseph performs tests and then bases his conclusions on the results of those tests, that he is applying the true scientific method, and people who say that his verified results are impossible because Lorentz says so, are not being scientifically honest. No honest person can ignore genuine scientific observations. Joseph's deduction that magnetic lines of force are formed of actual physical particles spinning in gyroscopic motion as they move along their magnetic path at the speed of light, was not something which was obvious to scientists, in spite of the fact that both Maxwell and Faraday had both explicitly described these lines of force as being kinetic magnetic energy. The spinning gyroscopic particle may actually consist of a particle moving in a spiral path along the line shell of force. As a wire passes in front of and across the end of a bar magnet, the current flows in one direction, pauses, and then flows in the opposite direction. This occurs due to the gyroscopic flow direction of the particles. For instance, on one side of the south end of the magnet, the lines of force spin up, while on the other side of that same south end, they spin down. A spinning gyroscope will move at right angles to the force acting on it, so as the gyroscopically spinning particles encounter the particles of the wire, they move up or down the wire at right angles to the direction in which they first encounter the wire. Please note that it is the gyroscopic spin direction of the particles which determines magnetic attraction or repulsion, and not the direction of flow of those particles along their line of force. Electric charges plus or minus determined by gyroscopic spin. Static charges attract and repel because of gyroscopic spin. Like charges spin in same direction, but outer periphery opposes and repels. Unlike charges spin in opposite direction, but outer periphery merges and attracts. It should also be realized that although we draw lines of force around a magnetic device, the reality is that these are really shells of force, and the magnetic flow is really like water flowing in a river. While we may draw arrows to indicate direction and strength of currents in a diagram of the river, the reality is, of course, that there is water flowing at all points in the river and not just along the lines which we decide to draw. The same applies to the magnetic flow around a magnet. It exists like a solid mass flowing through and around the magnet. You don't see it or feel it because the particles are so small. Now to the details of how to construct a device to take advantage of this magnetic movement and output more power than is required to make it operate. Let me remind you again that we are talking here of a coefficient of performance, COP, which is greater than 1 in a system which has an overall power efficiency of less than 100%. This is, of course, due to the additional energy flowing in from the zero-point energy field. Joseph visualizes the apparent energy gain as being conversion of a small amount of matter into its energy form, energy equals mass times speed of light squared, and while this is probably correct, it will be particles of the zero-point energy field which are being converted into their energy form and not particles from the metal of the magnet. It must be remembered that the particles of the zero-point energy field keep swapping over from energy to physical form all the time anyway. Energy is never used up but merely converted from one form to another, and the zero-point energy field contains such a staggering amount of energy that all of the visible matter in the whole of the universe could be created from the energy in a single cc of the zero-point energy field. So, if a few sub-microscopic particles of the zero-point energy field switch into their energy form to produce what looks like excess power to us, that is an item so trivial to the field that it is not even worth mentioning, less than the effect of taking one grain of sand off a beach 100 miles long. The conventional conception of the way things are is so far away from reality that it is ridiculous, and that is even without saying anything about the effect that the time-axis dimension has on the energy balance and flow of energy. But back to Joseph's design. Firstly, he points out that it is generally agreed, courtesy of Gustav Kirchhoff, that in the situation shown here, meters show same current out of coil as current into coil in the same instant of time. In any given instant of time, the amount of current flowing into the system, x, is exactly matched by the amount of current flowing out of the system, x. But, if measuring equipment is attached across the coil at the moment of switch off, an additional amount of current, x, flows out of the coil. This is generally agreed, and it suggests that a quantity of current x flows into the coil and yet a quantity of 2x flows out of it, cop equal to. Joseph examines this situation in practical detail as follows. Weak magnetic field. Consider an air-cored coil with an interior diameter of 10 feet, a height of 8.32 feet and wood with 1000 feet of 40-gauge copper wire. That length of wire has a resistance of 1049 ohms and weighs 0.02993 pounds. If 100 volts DC is connected across it, then a current of about 95 milliamps will flow, which is a power input of 9.5 watts. With just 31.8 turns, it will produce a weak magnetic field of 0.012 Gauss, with a mere 0.000014 joules of energy stored in it. With a tiny inductance of just 0.003 henries, if the current is stopped and the ends of the coil shorted together, only an insignificant current would flow. Now, repeat the experiment, but this time, use 5-gauge copper wire. As it has a resistance of 0.3133 ohms per 1000 foot length. To equal the same resistance and match the previous current flow, a massive length of 3,348,000 feet needs to be used. This length of wire will weigh 335,469.6 pounds, which is 16.77 tons. The 10-foot interior diameter coil, 8.32 feet tall, wound with this wire will have about 90,000 turns. If 100 volts DC is now connected across the coil, the same 95 milliamp current will flow with an input power of 9.5 watts, the same as before. But due to the massively larger coil, it has a magnetic field of 23.7 Gauss, which is 1905 times larger than the previous coil, and with 116 joules of energy stored in the magnetic field. This is a phenomenal 8 million times more energy than in the 40-gauge coil of the previous example. A phenomenally larger current flow would now occur if the current input was stopped and the coil shorted out, as that would generate an inductance of 25,700 henries, which is more than 8 million times the inductance of the previous coil. Phenomenally stronger magnetic field. Joseph then built a smaller version of his design, as shown here. This prototype used 5-gauge insulated copper wire weighing 4,200 pounds and 300 pounds of 30-gauge copper wire wound over the 5-gauge winding, and a massive 4-foot-long, 20-inch diameter permanent magnet of some 600 pounds in weight. The coil was wound with an inner diameter of 4 feet and a height of about 3 feet, wound on a fiberglass tube. The overall weight was about 5,000 pounds. Everybody who was asked, based on your expertise, how much power would be necessary to simply operate this device mechanically? Answers ranged from 200 watts to 1000 watts. On learning that it had an air-cored coil, other skilled individuals stated that in their expert opinion, the unit would be highly inefficient since it contained no iron core. However, From the design information already presented here, it can be shown that the actual necessary power input is less than 1.5 watts, providing a power output far in excess of 100%. Dr. Roger Hastings, principal physicist at Sperry Univac Corporation and former associate professor of physics at North Dakota State University, tested this prototype and showed that it had an 800% efficiency, that is a coefficient of performance of 8.0, which is impressive. In addition, Dr. Hastings estimated that with a 1.5 watt power input, the back EMF exceeded 80,000 watts. In operation, the 600-pound, handmade magnet rotates at just 200 RPM. Joseph's patent, which is in the appendix, indicates 4 different ways of implementing his design principles. It is very clear that Joseph has proved his point by producing and constructing a device which Oliver Lorentz considered to be impossible, thanks to his throwing out the free energy sections of Maxwell's equations. Joseph Newman has clearly earned our respect. You can see J.L. Naughton's builds and tests of small models at http://jnaudin.free.fr/html/qm11bp.htm.